Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je tiens à vous souhaiter la bienvenue parmi nous dans la quatrième édition de l'émission The Pro I Want to Be, qui a pour but de mettre en relief les différents métiers qui découlent des formations du UM6P et qui va se dérouler en français et en anglais. Je me présente, je suis Hibel Falah, étudiante en première année master en sciences et ingénierie des matériaux, lancée par le département Material Science and Nano-Engineering. Je cède la parole à Fatima.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of the series, The Pro I Want to Be. I am Fatima Zamba, a first-year master's student at the School of Collective Intelligence.
C'est un plaisir d'avoir parmi nous professeur Fatem Zahra Ben Marrakchi et professeur Kahal Omadagan. Bonjour.
Bonjour tout le monde et merci pour l'invitation. Je suis Fatem Zahra Ben Marrakchi, Researcher and Education Fellow à l'École de l'intelligence collective et coordinatrice du Master Collective Intelligence. Je travaille dans le domaine de la technopédagogie, qui est une science qui étudie les méthodes d'enseignement qui intègrent les nouvelles technologies de l'information et de communication, et plus spécifiquement auprès des apprenants ou bien des enfants qui sont face à la difficulté scolaire, comme la dyslexie et l'autisme. And now I think it's your turn, Carl.
Thanks. Hello, my name is Kahal Omadagan. I'm the Scientific Director of the School of Collective Intelligence. Thank you very much for the invitation to be on the show. And I'm an assistant professor as well in the school, and I research developmental psychology and how groups perform best. That's from a lot of different perspectives, including philosophy and psychology.
Cette quatrième édition porte sur le super pouvoir de l'intelligence collective. Tout d'abord, qu'est-ce que c'est que l'intelligence collective et pourquoi le super pouvoir et non pas un pouvoir?
D'accord, je vais commencer par la définition. L'intelligence collective, c'est la capacité à résoudre des problèmes autant que groupe où la capacité collective surpasse de la capacité individuelle. Et pour répondre à la deuxième partie de votre question, je vais vous donner un exemple. Imaginons qu'on donne une question à 10 personnes et que chaque personne a une chance d'avoir raison. Et donc, on peut déterminer on peut trouver que la réponse de la majorité du groupe a une chance d'être juste en comparaison avec la réponse de chaque ou bien d'une personne seule. Alors, cette capacité de se mettre d'accord pour résoudre des problèmes complexes au sein des groupes, c'est notre intelligence collective. Et pourquoi on le nomme comme ça super pouvoir? Parce que c'est un pouvoir exceptionnel qui donne aux individus ou bien aux membres des groupes une capacité de résoudre des problèmes complexes ou bien des sujets assez sérieux et en utilisant des méthodes efficaces et ça, il peut dépasser ou bien surpasser la capacité individuelle. C'est pourquoi on l'appelle le pouvoir ou bien le super pouvoir de l'intelligence collective.
And what about the concept of the wisdom of crowds and crowdsourcing? Are they any different from collective intelligence?
So collective intelligence, you could say, is this very general idea that refers to really any way in which a group can outperform the abilities of its members. And that can take place in decision-making. So you could find that to make an effective decision or a reliable decision, a group could have a far higher chance of making a reliable decision than any one of its members, if it's organized in the right way. Mm-hmm. Or it could refer to learning. So we know that children and adults learn better in groups than on their own. And this really goes back to some fundamental features of human psychology, that we are ultimately a social animal. We're maybe the most social animal. And so we perform best in groups over our performance as individuals. So crowdsourcing is one example of collective intelligence. It's one method for getting information out of a group. And for example, a very simple example of crowdsourcing is an election, where you want to try to get a solution to the question which political party should be in control. And so you ask everybody in the country. That's a big crowd, and you're sourcing the information from the crowd. But there are lots of different ways of organizing groups to get that information out of them. So, for example, you could take the majority vote, or you could start to weight individual answers by their expertise. So if some people in the group have a history of making really reliable predictions, you might want to weight their answers more than other people in the group. And then there's a lot of different ways of computational tools that allow people to take part in big group decision-making online. So these would be methods of crowdsourcing as well, literally building the tool that is effective at gathering the opinions of many people.
Right. So we know that intelligence is not unique to humans. Other primates also possess an ability to think collectively. So what makes us unique? What makes our collective intelligence as humans special?
Right. So, yeah, you'll see a lot of cases discussed of animals behaving in apparently collaborative ways, and there is a sense in which they are collaborating. So, for example, you have this thing called honeybee democracy, where you have bees that try to decide where to go to build their next hive. And so hundreds of bees will come back to the nest, and if there's a majority, believe it or not, of the waggle dances going in the same direction, the hive will head off in that direction. And that's kind of a collective intelligence in the case of bees. But what the bees probably don't do is they're not thinking about one another's intentions, and they're not thinking about one another's plans. They act in this way, and it has this outcome that is beneficial to the group, but each individual bee is not really thinking about what they're doing. Whereas humans, one of the really distinctive features of humans is that we're constantly thinking about what other people are thinking. So we think about what the world looks like from somebody else's point of view, or while we're having a conversation, we think about what exactly is it that you're asking me. So I change my answer depending on what I think you know or what you don't know. And so this feature is the distinctive mark of human collective intelligence, that it's built out of every individual's ability to think about what the other people in the group want.
Madame Fatem Zahra, vous avez parlé tout à l'heure du pouvoir de l'intelligence collective. D'après vous, quels sont les facteurs qui rendent l'intelligence collective d'un groupe plus élevée que celle d'autres?
Oui, effectivement, on s'interroge plus souvent pourquoi certains groupes sont-ils efficaces que d'autres. Bien sûr, il existe, ou bien il y a des facteurs qui influencent sur la performance des membres du groupe, soit d'une manière positive ou négative. Bon, je vais vous donner deux facteurs clés que je pense qui sont très importants. Alors, le premier facteur pour moi, c'est la diversité des membres du groupe. Et une diversité, soit une diversité de façade ou cognitive, afin d'enrichir la productivité et aussi de favoriser la créativité. Soyons clairs qu'une diversité de façade ou bien une diversité de cognitive peuvent jouer un rôle très important dans l'intelligence collective. Et pour l'intelligence, par la diversité de façades, c'est-à-dire des personnes de différents profils au niveau de genre et nationalité, et la diversité cognitive, c'est au niveau de background, bien de profil et aussi de culture et éducation. Et voilà, les études aussi ont démontré qu'une diversité cognitive a vraiment influencé ou bien influence positivement sur la performance des membres du groupe. Bien sûr, si cette diversité est utilisée d'une manière modérée. Et une bonne et réelle illustration de cette diversité, c'est notre programme ou bien nos étudiants de notre programme formation master en intelligence collective. On a une diversité remarquable, on a des apprenants, bien des étudiants de différentes nationalités, on a des Marocains, des béninois, aussi des Nigériens, et ont des différents profils. On a des informaticiens, des mathématiciens, et je pense qu'il y en a des personnes, bien des étudiants qui ont un background en éducation, en linguistique. Et cette diversité a vraiment joué un rôle très important dans la performance des groupes. On a remarqué que le travail en groupe a un résultat très favorable quand il y a une diversité, soit cognitive ou une diversité de phases. Et un deuxième facteur clé, c'est la communication et la coordination. Bien sûr que la communication, bien dans la manière dont les personnes du groupe communiquent entre eux, il peut être soit, ou bien il peut influencer soit positivement ou négativement si les membres communiquent plus, alors que l'intelligence collective du groupe augmente et vice-versa. Et aussi la communication, bien la coordination entre les groupes, il engendre aussi les supports de communication bien choisis et bien adaptés, et aussi le bon choix du plan de communication.
Just like Professor Fatima Zahra explained, we often think of how to take advantage of each individual's intelligence in order to find solutions for problems that otherwise wouldn't be found individually. But what about collective stupidity? How can we avoid it? And how can we make a group more intelligent than its worst individual?
So, because there are lots of different ways of putting the opinions of a large group of people together, we know that some of those ways work well and some of those ways actually don't work well. So, for example, if you were to ask a large group of people some question and the answer was yes or no, well, the majority answer to that question is actually remarkably reliable. And so we found that even if, as Fatima Zahra was saying, even if each individual in a group has like a 0.6 chance of getting the answer right, so just above average, the majority answer to the group will actually be extremely reliable, which is even if you only have a small number of people, like 10 people, which is amazing. So the majority answer becomes far more reliable than even potentially the smartest person in the group. But groups can organize themselves in all sorts of different ways. So you could have everybody following a leader, where the leader isn't necessarily the smartest person in the group, or where you're not taking advantage of all of the insights in the group. And so if you organize a group in that way, it may be the case that the overall performance of the group just ends up being exactly the same as the performance of the person who's making the decisions. If that person is not listening to people around them, for example, or if they're not having input on the decisions, if everybody in the group is not giving some input into the decisions, then the reliability goes down. And so you can see this, you can prove this mathematically, and you can draw little graphs showing you exactly how this works. And so we know this really reliably, that there are some ways that work and some ways that don't. So some people talk about the mob, the mind of the mob, when people start panicking and they all start following somebody who's acting in a strange way, and who knows why that is. That's not a smart behavior, but you can organize groups in ways that are smart. So the crucial thing to know is that groups can be very smart, but they have to be organized in the right way. So it's not automatic. And so we have to figure out what these ways are. And then the idea is that in our companies, in our governments, in non-governmental organizations, we begin to take advantage of these new discoveries and organize ourselves in ways that makes us smarter.
All right, thank you.
L'intelligence collective suscite un intérêt croissant ces derniers temps. Pourquoi et quelles sont les perspectives de cette discipline?
Oui, c'est vrai, on remarque que dans ces derniers temps, l'intelligence collective occupe une place très importante dans les institutions et les entreprises. Et ce concept a réussi à s'intégrer d'une manière considérable et peut apporter des résultats concrets. Et personnellement, je pense que l'intelligence collective est une perspective qui peut être appliquée à de nombreux domaines. Je donne l'exemple de le domaine de l'éducation. Et je pense si on intègre l'intelligence collective, ou bien plus précisément collaborative learning, ou bien l'apprentissage collaboratif dans les systèmes d'éducation, l'école de demain ou bien l'université de demain, ou voire même le préscolaire, si on intègre cette nouvelle orientation qui s'intéresse à l'apprentissage en groupe, où le savoir se construit en travaillant en groupe. Et je pense sûrement qu'il va apporter des résultats favorables, surtout que l'apprentissage collaboratif peut être utilisé dans ces deux modes, soit le virtuel ou bien le réel, ou même l'hybride, si on peut combiner les deux modes. Bien sûr, on peut utiliser les dernières avancées les technologies d'information et de communication basées sur l'intelligence artificielle, alors que tout ça peut vraiment donner des résultats favorables au niveau de l'apprentissage, ou bien concernant, disons, si on veut créer une nouvelle approche ou bien une nouvelle orientation qui peut s'appliquer à toutes les écoles ou bien tous les établissements de demain. Je pense que l'intelligence collective, c'est un perspective de demain, surtout dans le domaine de l'éducation qui est mon intérêt de recherche.
Merci. Alors, de l'avant-dernier épisode de cette série, déroulé sous la thématique « Le rôle de l'intelligence artificielle et des mathématiques appliquées », l'une des questions posées, est-ce que l'intelligence artificielle peut rivaliser avec l'intelligence humaine? Donc, ma question, est-ce que l'intelligence collective peut surpasser celle des machines? Sinon, comment l'intelligence artificielle peut-elle doper l'intelligence collective?
Bon, cette question, on peut avoir plusieurs réponses, mais je vais vous donner mon avis, un avis personnel. Alors, je pense que l'intelligence artificielle ne peut pas dépasser ou bien surpasser l'intelligence collective. C'est vrai que les machines peuvent traiter des informations de grande quantité, mais personnellement, je pense que le cerveau humain ne peut pas être comparé avec la machine. On ne peut pas comparer cette connexion magique entre des milliers de neurones avec une machine, la machine que l'homme l'a créée. Par contre, l'utilisation de l'intelligence artificielle peut favoriser l'intelligence collective. Parfois, on peut l'utiliser pour créer des nouvelles relations avec les membres du groupe et aussi les membres qui travaillent sur des différents projets qui sont communs, l'intelligence artificielle peut les regrouper et comme ça, on peut favoriser l'intelligence collective et augmenter notre intelligence collective. Et pensez aux problèmes les plus sérieux d'aujourd'hui, tels que la pandémie du coronavirus ou tel de changement climatique, alors que l'intelligence collective des membres du groupe, quand ils se regroupent, ces membres pour résoudre un problème ou bien pour travailler sur des solutions en utilisant des techniques avancées telles que l'intelligence artificielle, on peut arriver à des solutions ou bien au moins à des pistes qui peuvent nous mener vers une solution à la fin.
Speaking of AI, when exactly do you think that collective intelligence will be the most sought after expertise, just like AI and data science currently are?
So yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I looked actually just before this at Google Ngrams, which is a very interesting source. So what you can do is you can put in the words like collective intelligence into a Google Ngram search, and it tells you how popular or how frequently this term is being used from something like 1800 to today. And it looks at lots of different books and newspapers. And so you can see something really interesting there, which is that from 2000 to today, the last 20 years, there's a huge spike in interest in collective intelligence. So it doesn't really change until about 2000, and then all of a sudden it increases by 200% in 20 years. Now, if you put in artificial intelligence and machine learning, you'll see that currently they're talked about a lot more. But the peak, when they were being talked about, is about 10 years ago. And in collective intelligence is slowly starting to catch up. So I think what's happened is a concept has been introduced to people, and people are starting to realize how important this is, to study how we interact as groups so that we know what the best way to organize ourselves is. And as we were saying, there are ways we can organize ourselves that don't work very well, and there are ways that work very well. And so people are starting to realize that as a science and as a set of methods and as a set of skills that you can train people to acquire, collective intelligence is becoming really important.
Right.
So I don't know if it's going to surpass AI and machine learning in the next year. It's not, of course. But I think it's going to continue to be more and more popular and more in demand.
All right. So the School of Collective Intelligence at the UM6P is the very first school to offer an interdisciplinary program that aims at shaping the future researchers and experts in collective intelligence. So what sort of careers the school is preparing its students for?
So it's a very interdisciplinary subject. And in fact, it's like one of those situations where in the 1970s, computer science was a brand new subject and there were no computer science departments. And the first one was opened in the 70s. And people at the time thought that that was a silly idea to have a department of computer science. But now, of course, it's one of the most in-demand degrees you can get. And so collective intelligence has taken a similar trajectory. So in the last 10 years, you've seen research centers specifically dedicated to collective intelligence opening up in Berlin and in Santa Fe in California and in Boston and MIT. And so this discipline brings together people who have worked originally on different things, but are all interested in this same question. People from data science, people from computer science, people from cognitive science, and people also from organizational management. So people who are trying to understand how companies work well together. And so we currently have 3 tracks, sort of loosely defined in the master degree. And the first one is cognitive science and human resources. So human resource departments, they often want to work with people who know how to develop tests to evaluate people that they are considering hiring. And this is really, these tests are really developed by cognitive scientists and psychologists. So coming out of this degree, you'll know how to put together an effective test to measure how people, for example, behave well in collaborative scenarios. So we expect that a lot of our graduates will work with human resources departments in this capacity. Also, a data analyst is something that you would be prepared to work as after this degree. So increasingly companies have large bodies of data that they need to understand. And it's a huge challenge to do this. And the tools of a data analyst are what you're learning in this degree. So data analysis is one of the careers that people could go on to do. Another big track here is working as a consultant for a company who is trying to get the best out of its structure and its workers. So we're doing various projects with big companies who are very interested in the methods that collective intelligence brings. And so there is an internship in the second year of the master's degree where you spend 6 months working with a company, building a project that's interesting to the company and also interesting to us as researchers. So it'll have genuine scientific interest and also be practically interesting for the company. And the companies that we work with are just the kinds of organizations that I described. So the likelihood is that once the project has been developed, you'll work in one of those companies.
Right, thank you.
Donc, quels sont les prérequis nécessaires pour suivre une formation en intelligence collective?
Les candidats doivent y avoir une capacité solide en traitement des données quantitatives et aussi un intérêt d'apprendre en groupe et aussi des connaissances au niveau de l'analyse des données et aussi l'intérêt ou bien l'envie à acquérir des connaissances dans des études scientifiques de l'esprit de l'humain, en général comment l'être humain pense, comment l'homme traite l'information et tout. Et on s'intéresse aussi au profil ou bien aux étudiants qui ont un diplôme de licence au plus dans une discipline scientifique, soit en informatique, physique, mathématiques, ou bien en psychologie, ressources humaines, gestion ou les sciences sciences de l'éducation. Avoir des connaissances en codage, ou bien en programmation informatique, en statistiques appliquées et en gestion, c'est un plus, mais pas une exigence d'admission. Par contre, la formation est en anglais, donc un bon niveau, ou bien un niveau élevé de maîtrise de l'anglais, c'est une exigence d'admission.
So, collective intelligence is an emerging field, and although some of its aspects are well-researched, a lot of other aspects are still under-researched. How is the school contributing to this growing field?
Thanks. So one of the things that we're looking at closely is collaborative learning. So generally speaking, we know that when students are engaged in collaborative groups, they do better than when they're not. So for the traditional classroom has the lecturer at the front of the class and the students sitting quietly taking notes at any level, so in university and also throughout schooling. And we know that actually students perform much better if they work in teams. But there's a huge amount that we don't know about exactly what the right teams are. So, for example, should they be the most diverse teams possible? Should they be gender matched? Should people work with other people who are at the same skill level as they are, or higher skill levels? And so one of the things we're putting a lot of work into is researching what exactly is the optimal group. Another idea that we're looking at is we're working with startup companies who are interested in trying to get people to put people in a position that they can start their own companies and get people excited about new ideas. But this general question of why a new idea gets taken up in a community, so why one person's idea gets everybody excited and another person's idea just doesn't, for some reason, stick, that's a big question, and we don't understand exactly how ideas get passed along between people. And that's something we're looking at and running experiments on to try to find out how to, for example, pitch your startup idea in the most convincing way. So those are two examples.
So one last question for you. How do you exactly think that collective intelligence can help Africa overcome its most pressing challenges?
Well, I think for Africa and every other continent, the biggest challenges that we face are challenges that we are not going to be able to solve without cooperation. Now, that sounds like a slogan, but it's very real. And the fact that we can organize ourselves in really effective ways in groups, if we understand how to do it, means that we need to take these tools and we need to use them in order to get people talking across borders, for example, across cultures, which is one of the things that we look very carefully at in the school. And also we need to develop the right methods for aggregating many beliefs. So if you take a huge citizen consultation, for example, let's say you want everybody in Morocco to come up with their best idea for how to address climate change, which is obviously a huge problem facing Africa and everybody else, then if you do that, if you have this big citizen consultation, you need to know how to put together, say, millions of proposals. And that's a big challenge, and that's something that we're working on and we're developing the tools to do. So I think this is how collective intelligence will help, is just by optimizing the ways in which we can work together.
I mean, with that, I think we have reached the end of this episode. Thank you, Professor Kahalo Madigan and Professor Fatima Zahra bin Marakshi, for accepting our invitation. It was a great pleasure having you with us today. We hope that you enjoyed our discussion today. And if you are keen to learn more about the different careers that the programs the university is offering, join us next week for a new episode tackling a new field and featuring new students and new experts. That's all for today. See you soon.